Well, obviously, this has been a week none of us will ever forget. President-elect Joe Biden calling what happened in Washington an unprecedented attack on our democracy. So where does America go from here? Joining us now to help us reflect and look ahead is NBC News correspondent and one of our favorite wordsmiths, Harry Smith, and Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian and author of Leadership in Turbulent Times, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Harry, Doris, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
And Doris, I'd like to start with you. You know, when we go through something like this, we kind of think, oh my gosh, we've never been through anything like this. But as we look at this story still being written, how does it compare to other dark days in our American history?
Well, you know, I think you said it just right. The story is still being written. You know, history sometimes looks at the events from the backward forward, and we think, oh my God, it all turned out all right. We're in that anxious phase of a story that will have a chapter beforehand and chapters after. Just think of the anxiety that Lincoln felt when he took over at the time of his inauguration. The South had already started seceding. A civil war was going to begin. He said if he'd ever known the anxiety he would feel, he wouldn't have thought he could have lived through it. Or think of the anxiety that Franklin Roosevelt felt when he first came to the Great Depression. The banks were failing. There was a sense that capitalism and democracy were at risk. Or the anxiety that the whole country felt in the early days of World War II when we had hardly the weapons we needed to stand up to Germany. And yet those stories ended with the Civil War ending and Union restored and emancipation intact. The Allies won the victory in World War II. So the question for us, when historians look at us 100 years from now, is we feel this enormous anxiety now, something terribly damaged happened to our democracy, but will it have led to an ending or at least a healing of the tribal politics? We've seen some indications of that, some bipartisanship, some Republicans saying let's not go through with the objections. Or will it exacerbate our divisions? And that's really up to us as a people. Problems created by people can be solved by people. And I think that's what history gives us solace. It lets us know we can hold and know what we're doing in the future. So you got to feel that sense of we can get a hold of this and make it better in the future.
Harry, you described Wednesday's events as un-American. I have to ask, because we have been through so many big events recently that after we go through them, we're like, this is a turning point. You know, I'm thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement. We're like, okay, this is a turning point in America. Do you think what just happened will be yet another turning point politically?
Well, you know, I go back to September, and President Trump was asked about a peaceful transition of power. And he says, I can't guarantee that. And immediately alarm bells went off in my mind. And excuse me, Doris, I'm going to go into a little history here. We think about George Washington walking away from the presidency. He was so wildly popular, he could have been president for life. He could have been emperor. But the American people elected a new president. There was a peaceful transition of power, and the world stood in awe that a country could do such a thing. It didn't require a coup. It didn't require a war. People did this on their own. So I feel like maybe the president made a serious mistake in not paying attention to the history of who, in fact, we are.
You guys are a great duo. We could talk to you all hour. Doris, this country, we haven't talked a lot about this part of it, but it's all over social media. This country obviously has a vast history of racial strife, which we continue to see again, as Dylan just referred to, in 2020. We thought it was interesting yesterday, former First Lady Michelle Obama, she released a statement in part saying, quote, seeing the gulf between the responses to yesterday's riot and this summer's peaceful protests and the larger movement for racial justice is so painful. She goes on to say it hurts. What's your perspective on what she was saying?
I mean, I think she's absolutely right. I mean, what whole 2020 has revealed, both in the inequitable response that people had to COVID because of the lack of access to health care where they were living, both to the response of the Black Lives Movement, which now compares to the response of the police to yesterday's movement. This was not a protest. This was not a peaceful protest. Black Lives Movement was a peaceful protest, sometimes turned violent, but the much greater response of the police in arresting those people versus what happened 2 days ago. just shows that we're still dealing in this country with the effects of slavery, with the effects of racism, and it's one of the things that we have to deal with in the future. It's the scar that's still on our system. And once again, you got to hope that these incidents, they just make us remember what are our ideals as a nation. We're still so far from those ideals, and Black Lives Movement was a way of pushing us forward, just like the Civil Rights Movement did. But we need leadership. We need leadership from the inside to help us with the people on the outside, and that's when change takes place. That's what happened at Selma, Alabama, those great movements in the 60s when the outside movement was able to push the inside people to make legislation that made us come closer to our ideals. That's that forward movement that we need now.
Harry, I look at this and I think sometimes this was horrible, but yet it maybe is a reminder of just how tenuous this experiment of democracy is, and maybe that this was a wake-up call that we needed.
You know, it really, we wrote the piece the other day about the Capitol building and what it stands for and all that has transpired there, and the strength that that building embodies in terms of it as an institution. Yet at the same time, we saw just how fragile it is. And I think it behooves all of us to pay attention to that, that what we have here is something extraordinarily special and unique in many ways in all the world. And we need to have at least some degree of reverence for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good discussion.
Yeah, things to think about as we go into the weekend. Harry Smith, Doris Kearns, Goodwin, thank you so much.